A lot to get through. It could take 6 hours on these sections. But let's jump straight in since we need to finish by 9:30. Is that correct?
By 9, I have to,
Oh,
because I
by
have to
now.
be at like in class at 9.
Well, then you
Or
better.
sorry, 9:30. I have to be at like,
Okay. Well, that's better.
yeah.
There's a lot to get through, and um, I realized maybe I should have asked you to read up to section 51 because that kind of ties some of the ideas together in a way that gives you more of an idea of what Kant's after with the notion of aesthetic ideas. It has to do with what he calls complete communication. And I can say a couple words about that. The other reason why it's maybe nice to say a word or two about that is that it does tie well into some of the things that Adorno and Horkheimer, in particular Adorno, is interested in, both in the dialectic of enlightenment, but also in general in his aesthetics, and it has to do with this idea of art's capacity to do a few things in addition. Well, there are basically two things that art can do that Kant develops in this section that's interesting for Adorno. One could be what you might describe as maybe just to paraphrase it in Adorno's own words from Negative Dialectics, where he says the need to give voice to suffering is a condition for all truth. And there, one of the things that Adorno thinks is that art can give voice to suffering in a way that positivistic science cannot, descriptive modes of explanation and so on cannot. And it has to do with the idea of Arshia, maybe this will ring a bell or two, the sense that people quite often have that there's something that needs to be communicated, either about their own experience, their identity, their place in the world, or something that lacks an intentional object in
Intention with an S.
intentionality,
Hmm.
right? And in fact, may be the sort of thing contra psychoanalysis that can never have an intentional object. That would be to give voice to suffering in
Hmm.
Adorno's terms. And that is a capacity that art in complete communication presumably has, according to Kant. And this idea of aesthetic ideas, this notion of aesthetic ideas, is kind of the engine or kind of the platform within which that can take place. Um, so we could get a little bit more detailed there and talk about it straight up, or we could go in chronological order and talk a little bit about genius and then aesthetic ideas and then complete communication as a kind of way of tying it all together. Essentially, though, without getting too detailed, one thing I will say is that complete communication involves not just conceptual communication, that's sort of um, denotative information transfer. It also involves what denotative information transfer. What do I mean by that? Because whenever I see people's eyes go up to, to their skulls, I know that something's gone wrong. So, what's denotation?
To refer to something.
Yeah, to
Right.
refer to something in what level of completeness,
Um,
or in what sense is a denotation?
it's in terms of concepts, right?
Yes, in terms of concepts, essentially what a denotation means is that that capacity of a word, a concept, or whatever to pick out something specific.
Right, right.
So maybe I should have said in what level of specification instead of completeness. Completeness is too fuzzy a term, but in what level of specification? In extreme specification, when it goes well, you know
Hmm.
exactly what I'm talking about, right? Denotation is kind of the enemy, or the enemy. Let's not put it in those terms. It's the other to this notion of a need to communicate what can never have a denotation. right? Okay. So, an information transfer is just the transferring of denotative information, exactly this meaning from me to you, from this period of history to that period of history, etc. In other words, translatability in a really complete sense, right? So that is one component of communication according to Kant. This is in section 51, by the way. It's at the very beginning of 51. So, um, you know, I don't want to get bogged down in it because our time is short, but the thing to keep in mind is that what Kant says is that that sort of communication, the sort of communication, for instance, Arshia, that Russell's interested in, right, in what you've
Yeah.
been reading, is not complete. It's not
Mm.
complete. How do we know it's not complete? Well, whenever we really, now, I should also say, we might only know that it's not complete in a sort of negative sense because we always feel that something's lacking whenever we communicate something. So it's possible that we never really get complete communication. It's just a sort of normative standard. But complete communication means something like this. When I communicate something to you, or let me put it this way. You know how things go wrong all the time when you write an email to somebody because it doesn't contain the tone of voice, it doesn't contain gesture, it doesn't contain timing, it doesn't contain all these sorts of things that actually do contribute to the meaning, but not in a strictly conceptual way. All of that, in addition to the conceptual meaning, if you get all of it right, if it's all there and it's all, I suppose, part of the experience of the communicative act, that would be complete communication. And Kant separates it into three divisions. There's the conceptual side. Actually, I should get his terminology just right. I don't want to misquote him. Um, there is, I believe it's basically something like concept, gesture, sensation. So let me just get that up really quickly here. How do I share my screen? It's been a while since I used Zoom. Oh my gosh. Okay, where are we at here? Okay, that's Adorno. Here is Kant, and let me go down to 51. Yes, okay. This is right at the top of 51, so you don't even have to read all of 51. It's kind of buried in this section that um, it's not buried because it's right at the top of the section, but it's under a heading that seems not to have a lot to do with what he's talking about in the beginning, the division of the fine arts. Why do we have all these different arts? Dance, theater, painting, music, etc. What he's going to want to say is that those aspects of complete communication that are not conceptual are also not translatable just because they're not conceptual, right? In other words, what he wants to be saying is that, whenever oh, I don't know. I mean, yeah, I could do it from the example of stand-up comedy. I remember when I was a teenager or something, recounting a Steve Martin stand-up routine to a teacher that I thought was just hilarious. And I said all the jokes, and the teacher had a mildly amused expression. It's like, "Oh, you don't think it's funny?" And then he said, "Well, you're not Steve Martin. What's going on there?" Right? Now that maybe is more of an affect-oriented sort of thing. Is it communicative or not? Uh, the point being, though, that there's something, whenever anybody says something like, you had to be there, you had to actually have that experience to get the full meaning. What they're saying is that there's something about this extra domain, this extra maybe substrate to complete communication that is not translatable. In other words, it's like an idiolect, right? It is, if you ever think that, for instance, this is maybe is one of the problems with data sonification, for instance, right? This idea that you can somehow recapture the essence of some phenomenon simply by translating it in a very precise and exact but also kind of arbitrary way into, say, music, sound, and somehow capture the effect. No, you can't just because there's always going to be some aspect to, for instance, let's say you want to um, capture the sense of standing next to the ocean and watching the tide come in, and you take the data from that and you apply it the same structures to, say, sound. So there's going to be a level of arbitrariness that makes part of that experience, part of the meaning. Now it's going to be non-conceptual meaning. It's going to be something like this sense of maybe vastness or mystery or something like that that does inform the meaning of what it is to stand at the ocean when the tide comes in. But the translation is going to fail because there's something um, idiomatic about what music can do as a platform that is does not accept the translation or cannot itself be translated into another medium. And so it's this non-translatability of the non-conceptual components of complete communication that explain why Kant thinks that you need to have different art forms because they're all specific in their own ways, and one can never truly be translated into the other. But in any case, the components of uh, complete communication are here he says it as word, in other words, the conceptual component, gesture, and tone, which then he says he gives other words for it, articulation, which would maybe be denotative specification, articulation in that sense, gesticulation, some kind of sense of motion, of visual communication, and modulation. So he also talks about it here, I believe. Communication, complete communication consists of the way people, so what complete communication might be is the way people express themselves in speech so as to communicate with one another as perfectly as possible, namely not merely as regards their concepts, but also as regards their sensations. And this is really significant, right? Because, if you think about what he wants to say about, well, for instance, in the Analytic of the Beautiful, the division between conceptual experience or conceptual thinking, conceptual judgment, and aesthetic judgment, there seems to be a sort of rift, a sort of uh, a sort of maybe incompatibility or incongruity between these things. In fact, actually, that's just derived from his sort of dualist conception of human beings having one foot in or one motivation from causality and one motivation from reasons, concepts, etc. Right. Um, but here in his description of complete communication, we see that sensation kind of comes back in and can actually play a role in the establishment of meaning.
Hmm.
And it's meaning in a sense that we often use that word. Meaning is a strange word because we use it in many different ways. It's very different from the way that analytic philosophers will use that word, at least in first half of the 20th century, where meaning specifically means having some sort of either capacity to be denotated or um, it'll have some kind of semantic content, conceptual content, this kind of thing. Very often, though, you stand next to the ocean and you say it was a meaningful experience, you don't mean that the ocean was denotating terms to you and giving you, jointly necessary and sufficient conditions for concepts, et cetera, and definitions. What do you mean when you say it was meaningful? Probably you mean something like what Kant is saying here, which is that there's an additional aspect to a fully meaningful act that is provided through sensation and not just through concepts, right? Okay, so that's this idea of complete communication, that there's always um, what Adorno later on will call a mythic substrate to language in general. to communication in general, the mythic substrate being, you know, all of that which is not conceptual and yet contributes to the meaningfulness of an utterance, of an experience, right? And that's what aesthetics is really after, right? It's all that stuff. Okay. So, yeah, question?
Yes. So I wanted to, so for Adorno, it's these two components, one of which is the capacity to give voice to suffering, and the other one being the mythic substrate, right?
Well, now, and those things are related, right? Isn't that
Yeah.
what the relation is? What is the relation?
No, no, it's well, that's the thing. I don't understand the mythic substrate as
Okay,
much.
the mythic substrate. Okay. Um, Here, mythic simply means um, there are a couple ways to define it. Myth literally means just what people say. Not that it's exactly
Hmm.
true or false in altheic sense, or not that it is actually meaningful in the sense of clear and precise concepts that are put into true propositions, etc. It's just what people say, which is so when Nietzsche, for instance, is developing in The Birth of Tragedy his idea of myths. One thing that he says is that it's not that the Greeks, for instance, really believe in the stories of their tragedies, for instance, in the sense of uh, being a historical account. There's even I've encountered the idea that the Greeks probably didn't actually even really believe in their gods in the way that Christian fundamentalists, for instance, believe in their gods, that they are a material fact, or maybe not material, but a true state of affairs that obtain in the world. What Nietzsche wants to argue is that what is mythic about tragedy is not that it's true or false in any literal sense, but simply that it's expressive of a particular way of being in the world. So, it doesn't matter that there was never anybody named Oedipus who killed his father and had children with his mother or whatever. That doesn't matter. What matters is the particular way that that gives voice to a way of being in the world. The way that it gives voice to being in the world is mythic in the sense that, in the very literal sense of it's just a way that people express their place in the world, not that it's true or false, and the truth or falsity of it is irrelevant. What is relevant is the particular sort of form, the expressive form that the myth takes that is indicative of a way of navigating your place in the world.
And is there a way to be able to analyze exactly how that form corresponds to that expression?
Uh, I suppose you could. Yeah. I guess there's a question about whether it's a correspondence or not, or if it's maybe even just sort of the same thing,
Hmm.
right? I mean, um, okay, so if I give you an expression, no, I will say that in an artwork, the expression is going to be sublimated in one way or another, right? That is to say, it's not going to be really the expression of grief.
Hmm.
Right? It's going to be the expression of grief that is somehow mediated through the structures and techniques of art to somehow either be made more general while still being tied to a specific figure. So in the case of Oedipus, Oedipus's tragedy, which is the tragedy for one man, is also the tragedy of us all as mortal beings in the world, or something like that. And that's only possible through the sorts of techniques that artworks employ. But, if what I wanted to say is that if, I perform some expressive act, and then you say, okay, so how does that correspond to the thing you're expressing? I go, oh, and it's a real thing, right? Like I'm not performing, I just did that. It's expressive. And you say, okay, so how does that correspond to your grief? The fact that you did that. I mean, it doesn't exactly correspond to it. It's like, it just is an outward bit of evidence of my grief. You know,
Hmm.
it's not correspondence in the way that on the correspondence theory of truth, true propositions somehow correspond to the thing they're describing because the expressive act doesn't describe anything.
Hmm.
It's not a description. It's, I suppose an outward manifestation of the affect or something like that, right? Actually, this is an important distinction between uh, art and language, understood as, maybe conceptual language or communicative language, right? That uh, to a certain extent, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. In fact, I don't, maybe sometimes it does, but most of the time, I don't think it really makes sense to talk about art in terms of reference, right? That is to say, if I wail like that, it's not like I'm referring to grief. I'm expressing it, which is just that it is the grief in it. Not, now there may be more to the grief than just the cry, but it's not that the cry refers to the grief, in the way that, oh, I don't know, uh, I suppose you might think of it as an effect of the grief if you wanted to. But the point is that I don't think it makes a lot of sense to think about expression uh, as being exactly analogous to explanation in the following way. An explanation, if you believe that what it's doing is actually mapping out true structures in the world, real structures that are out there, then you need some account of the correspondence between the explanation and the structure. But an
Hmm.
expression doesn't need that because it's just inextricably tied to the thing of which it is an expression,
Hmm. Hmm.
right?
Hmm. It's simply a part of it, right?
Yeah, yeah, it's like you could take like a dual aspect view of it. It's like the outward aspect of a phenomenon that has both inward and outward components or something like that,
Hmm.
right? In any case, the extra bits of complete communication, tone, gesture, etc., are fulfilling that role. Right. Now, back to the question, what does this idea that truth, a necessary condition of truth, is to give voice to suffering? And um, what was the other part of the question that you asked? What did we want to connect that to?
Um, the mythic substrate
The mythic
or this.
substrate, right. Okay. So the mythic substrate is going to be expressive in the sense that I just developed, right?
Mm.
Not explanatory in the way that concepts can be leveraged to explain. It's expressive, but what that means is it's giving voice to something, but what it's giving voice to lacks a specific denotative object, right? There is no concept for it.
Mm.
Now, when Kant is developing the idea, or I'll try to make my language more clear, the notion of aesthetic ideas, he gives us a clue as to why it may be that no concept can ever be adequate to what aesthetic ideas are doing. Why it is that concepts can never give full voice to, say, suffering. And here we might think of suffering in a more formal sense. It doesn't just mean bad emotions or whatever. We might think of suffering as simply the inability to give voice to something that needs expression. Okay. And it might be something really joyous too. You know? um, in the case of Adorno, it's always kind of sad because he thinks that um, life is kind of sad in a way. Or that is to say, there's always a kind of pain in the inability of the world, the social political world as we live in it, the inability of that to live up to the promise of our own freedom, the promise of our own subjective power, and so on. And so, even the inability to express something joyous in a way is kind of sad,
Hmm.
um, because you can't actually, maybe within the specific limitations of rational technical society, that is to say, tech bro society or whatever, um, there is no way to fully give voice in maybe like a true and unironic, unsarcastic way, that sort of sense of a desire for utopia, a desire for like the true satisfaction of the potential of human freedom and so on. So it's always kind of suffering, even when the thing you're trying to express is happy. But back to this idea of the inadequacy of concepts, discursivity, denotation, etc., explanation, to give voice to that sort of aspect of human experience, awareness, etc., that nonetheless needs expression. There's something that Kant says about aesthetic ideas that, according to him anyway, shows why concepts will always fail. So that's kind of the big picture that he's getting to through this section, this idea of an aspect to human communication that is not conceptual, but nonetheless needs expression. And that's what arts do. That's what aesthetic experience is supposed to make possible. All right, so that is where we're going. Let's go back to the beginning of this excerpt that I gave you, section 44 through 50. Couple things to talk about. So I would like you guys to try to give me some summaries about his concepts of genius, and then for me, the more interesting concept of aesthetic ideas. And we'll try to wrap it all together in some kind of comprehensible way. All right. So what's genius? I mean, he gives actually a pretty precise definition. He has a tendency to give a definition and then let it kind of spiral off into very um, hard to follow, conceptual tangents and whatnot. But there are some pretty precise things he says about genius. So let's start with that. Maybe we could go back to 44. I'll turn off my screen, and I'll also
Hmm.
allow sharing amongst you guys. I forget how to do that now. It's been a while. My goodness. Here we go. Multiple participants can share. Okay. Okay. Oh no, this is bad. It should be
It's
46.
very difficult because I
Well,
was
let's start with 46, because this is a place that
okay.
he, right off the bat, is doing things that look like definitions.
Hmm.
So he makes an identity statement, so that's good if we're looking for definitions.
Well, right off, it's the talent that gives the rule to an art. To art,
To
since
art, yeah.
talent is an innate productive ability of the artist. So there's that
Let's
part
read
where he like,
the whole paragraph, because
okay.
it gives you a kind of more limited definition, or I'll say maybe a more superficial definition, but we still don't know what talent is. So it's like, okay, well, if you wanted to find genius as a talent, then we need to know what a talent is.
Mm,
And then what he does is wrap the whole thing together in a fuller definition. So let's just read the whole thing. Go for
sure.
it, Arshia.
Okay. So, well, I guess there by the whole paragraph, do you mean just like right up to where it says whatever?
Just
But
to the bottom of the page.
yeah. So it says genius is the talent in parentheses natural endowment that gives the rule to art. Since talent is an innate productive ability of the artist and as such belongs itself to nature, we could also put it this way. Genius is the innate mental predisposition through which nature gives the rule to art.
Okay, let's unpack that and see if we can figure out or remember what follows from that.
So, first question I had about that section was, what is natural endowment? What does that mean?
Well, I think it's pretty a pretty normal use of language here. I use
Oh,
it
okay.
technical. Uh,
Okay.
so if I say you have a natural endowment for something, what does that mean?
It's not, it doesn't mean anything like beyond the ordinary use of it, because that's how Kant kind of
Give me an
uses
example
these.
of somebody who has a natural endowment for something.
I don't know.
Maybe we're also jaded and cynical and think that everything is simply every thing that anybody does well is simply an effect of mass marketing and that sort of thing. But come on,
Is it just like some uh I don't know, like think like I'm thinking of a child prodigy or something.
yeah.
Like
Well, that would be an
like
example,
Mozart.
right? How did Mozart learn to do that?
I mean, he had some guidance and instruction, but for the
Well,
most
lots of
part,
kids had
he
that had yeah, okay.
right. He just
Lots of
but for
other
the
kids
most
had
part,
it, and they didn't all have Mozart's ability. So where did he get it from?
he
Uh,
just had the natural endowment.
Nature.
Yeah, right.
That's what a natural
Okay.
endowment is. Yeah, that's what a talent
Yeah.
is, right? I mean,
Huh.
actually, this word talent is being used in a pretty normal way.
Mm,
Nothing
mm.
terribly technical about it. There are, however, knowing what we know about Kant's uh, um, transcendental idealism, his notions about nature and experience. There are a few things that we might be able to draw just from this definition that are descriptive of how we think about genius.
Mm.
Um, if it's nature giving the rule to art, where is the artist in that?
Is it the artist is what bears that mental predisposition?
Yeah, that's true. Okay. It's interesting. I could say, where is subjectivity in this?
Mm.
And the artist is just, you know, the instance of subjectivity, but where is subjectivity in this? And what is subjectivity, Arshia? We mean it in a sort of technical sense here.
Yeah, subjectivity. So the subject is what perceives the object.
Yes, and what other powers are associated with that?
What do you mean?
Well, perception is a power. You have the ability, the
Oh,
power. What
oh, oh,
other
oh.
powers are associated with? I'm gonna change my seating position because the sun's going into my eyes. But yeah,
Hmm.
okay.
So the uh it's the power of cognition um and judgment that also
Yeah.
comes along
Yeah.
with.
Judgment's really, this is the critique of judgment, but yeah, judgment
Mhm.
means the ability to take a stand on, the ability to decide, the ability to be responsible for. Those are all
Mhm.
things that follow from judgment, right? Well, where is that in this? If it's nature that's giving the rule to art.
Hmm. So is it just simply like nature that is
Yeah, I
making the
mean, it
judgments?
does seem like he's kind of minimizing the role of subjectivity here, right?
Hmm.
Which is maybe a way of saying, like whenever whenever you have a good idea. Actually, this is something that Nietzsche says. I wish I always misquote and paraphrase. Sorry, but Nietzsche says something like this: a good idea comes when it will, right? where's my role as a decider, as an executive in having a good idea? Maybe simply just to be the vessel through which a good idea comes. Well, what is the agent there? It's nature or something kind of inscrutable, right?
Hmm.
So this is something really important. I said before a couple of weeks ago or whenever, Arshia, that nature as nature, not nature is mediated through concepts, etc., is actually completely inscrutable, right? And you can think about like, um, all right, let's take the amoeba, maybe. I don't know. What's the difference between the amoeba, which actually seems to perform all sorts of basically rational actions? It is hungry, it seeks out nourishment, I don't know, I guess is horny or something and divides. Are amoebas single cell, like, they're single cells, but I don't remember if they're uh, asexual reproducers or not. I think they are. But in any case, there are all sorts of motivations, presumably, and the amoeba acts in regular, seemingly rule-governed ways and seems to it will avoid, like if you drop a bunch of chemicals in the petri dish, it will avoid the chemicals and so on. Well, that seems reason governed or rule governed anyway. What's the difference between the amoeba and us? The amoeba has what you might describe as a complete unity with nature. It just is nature.
Hmm.
We have this extra sort of level of taking a stand on nature, which you can think of as, concepts, the ability to refer to nature, about the ability to think about and predict and remember and all this kind of stuff, all this mental activity. Um, but that mental activity, to a certain extent, uh, it cuts us off from nature because it's like taking a stand on or modeling nature. Um, and it's what makes us aware of the fact that we're in nature. But the fact that we're aware of being in nature means that we don't have that complete unity in the way that an amoeba does, right? Which is also to say that nature outside of that is completely inscrutable, right? Well, that's also the case with genius. Where does that idea come from? Nature. But I don't know where it came from. Subjectively, you know, the idea will come when it will, not when I choose for it to come.
Hmm.
Right. So, that's one facet of this definition, this idea that there is something about genius which is completely inscrutable, um, and outside of the subjective power of the person that has that capacity, has that talent.
So is that why he says something along the lines of fine art cannot itself devise the rule by which it is to bring its product, bring about its product?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Hmm.
Because, you know, what that would mean is that I could, if that were possible, if it could devise the rule, then what that could mean is that all I would have to do is think, about some first principles and infer what must logically follow from that. And whenever I perform that inference, I have a great work of art. It would be like the idea that all you have to do is follow. Um, this is actually a good example for thinking about counterpoint, right? Like counterpoint gives you a bunch of rules. Most of the time, though, it's interesting. It doesn't really give you positive rules. It gives you prohibitions,
Hmm.
right? Don't have parallel fifths. Don't have consecutive dissonances. Don't. Doesn't really tell you what to do. Yeah, and so the rules that we can place down on artistic production are generally negative. Don't have the flute playing in the lowest register, et cetera, or whatever, But in terms of like actually forming the right kind of idea, it's pretty hard to uh, think about how you could have a rule for that. Essentially, what he's saying is that um, while every art has its medium, has the specific uh, characteristics of the medium and certain physical properties and that sort of thing. And all of those things can be laid down in systems of rules. Those systems of rules are never sufficient for the actual production of really kind of, vibrant living art. Right. So you can't just follow rules. Rules are a necessary condition, but they're not sufficient. But what's interesting is that when you do have a work that is, you know, like groundbreaking and just sort of, you know, whatever adjectives we want to use for a really powerful artwork that is original, Kant calls it a work of genius. So let's just adopt that. Whenever you have a work of genius, that extra aspect of it, which is to say beyond just the rules, nonetheless is not completely arbitrary and completely nonsensical. It can actually serve as the model for a new rule governed way of thinking, right? So in other words, whatever. I don't know what examples we would want to choose, but you know, let me think. Maybe actually, I will say that one thing that seems to be true about Kant here, which is different from the way that Hegel thinks about this, is that acts of genius aren't that rare. He does say that it's rare for someone to have the right kind of talent to produce a work of art, but anytime we have the sense that a work of art is more than just the productive rules, that would be an act of genius, right? So
Hmm.
it's not like it's only Beethoven's Ninth Symphony that is a work of genius. What Kant is actually trying to describe is something that is probably a little bit more common in creative production, which is to say that extra something beyond just following the rules that um, makes an artwork vibrant, great, whatever. But the point being that, when you have a work that thinks outside the box, sort of recontextualizes the world in a powerful way, it's not just nonsense. It's as though the artist is sort of from nowhere creating a new rule. But the fact that it is a rule means that it is normative, that it has a structure to it that is not just completely nonsensical or completely arbitrary, right? And so this is one of these places where, to a certain extent, I mean, it's like that very mind-bending question, where does logic come from? Where do
Hmm.
rules come from? Right. And it's very, very difficult to fathom sort of question. And, there are a few different theories that are out there, but it's that sort of question, how is it that someone can produce a new thing that doesn't follow a specific model or a specific rule, and yet nonetheless can act as a model, can act as a new rule, right? That's what an active genius is supposed to be. You look a little confused there, Archie, are you?
No, no, no. I was just trying to think of no, it's interesting because it's like what I'm trying to think of is that for Kant, it just seems to be like totally just nature given, right? Like it's
I
something that you
would say a
either
little
have
bit.
or you don't have.
I would say that that's true. Yeah. I guess one thing that we might want to ask is like, um, are there different components or different facets to it? Is it possible that everybody has the capacity, or that is to say, everybody has the need to express themselves in a way that's original or something like that? It's just that some people don't do it very well.
Hmm.
But there the problem is the expression, not necessarily the need to express what cannot or has not yet been expressed, right?
As if there's a second stage to uh
Yeah, in fact, it
to that
seems to
process.
me that in order for an act of genius to be communicable or to be received at all, everybody has to have the first part of that, the ability to recognize when something that needs expression but has not yet been expressed. The moment when that is expressed, everybody, in order to recognize that, needs to be able to have that capacity.
Hmm.
What seems to be lacking, though, in a lot of people is the ability to express that, the express the unexpressible or the not yet expressed, right? Um, and that actually seems right. I think that, there is something universal about genius, which we know, well, maybe it's not completely universal, who knows? There may be people that, for whatever reason, lack this ability. But if you're able to recognize an act of genius, then there is a sense in which you also have some component, uh, or some sort of um, you share in the act of genius to an extent that you can recognize it,
Hmm.
even if you yourself can't express it, right? And by the way, he also says, I don't remember exactly where this is, but that so a couple things. One, the genius can't themselves really explain how they do it, according to him, because it's not them that chose it. It's not their own subjective judgment. It is nature. Um, so they can't explain how it happened. They also um, uh, can't choose. That is to say, if it's not like being a genius on Kant's account. And by the way, this is something that I think distinguishes him from the kind of mythology of, say, classical music or whatever. It's not that everything a genius does is always ingenious. Genius is just that moment when they're able to, whatever, channel nature in just the right way and express it in just the right way. But it doesn't mean they're ever going to do it again.
Hmm.
Or if they do it again, it's not that they're going to do it every single time, right? There's this sense of caprice or this sense of maybe spontaneity or something to that moment that one, they channel the, nature is channeled in just the right way and expressed in just the right way. But there's never a guarantee that every time someone that has done something ingenious in the past is going to be ingenious the next time,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? That's, by the way, I think a really important thing to consider because that is quite different from the way we use that word genius, say, in culture, right? That here it really does seem to be that genius is a way of describing a sort of activity that maybe some people perform more than others, but not that genius is an ontological category.
Hmm.
It's not that person is a genius and that person isn't. What we might say is, this person has performed acts of genius, or this person performs more acts of genius in general than this other person, but that person has no real power over when they're going to be a genius.
Hmm. Because when the idea comes, it comes,
Yeah,
right?
essentially, yeah, that's right.
And so, where does Kant get this notion from? Like, is there? I'm like wondering more historically, I suppose. Is there a?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. As far as I know, this is a kind of, I guess, sorry, now I'm all in shadow. Maybe I'll go back over here because we're playing a little bit. As far as I know, this is a new way of using the word genius. So I guess there are a couple different ways to answer that question. One way to answer it is to look at the ways people have used the word genius. The other way to answer it is to say, are there other comparable concepts that might go by different names in history? Right. I'll answer the first question. The word genius, as far as I understand, was not used this way until Kant.
Hmm.
If you look at, so there's a pretty well-known work by Rene Descartes called um, Rules for the Direction of the Mind. And there in Latin, it's originally a Latin text, the word for mind is ingenium, which means, it's not exactly the same form, but it's still derived from genius, the same root. It's rules for the direction of your genius, essentially, is a way that it could be translated. And from that point of view, it's exactly antithetical to the way that Kant is using the word genius, right?
Yeah, because it's giving rules
Yeah,
to
exactly.
genius, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. Um,
And the
so
direction of it also
yeah, the
interesting too.
direction of it, right, exactly. As
Yeah.
though re subjective reason has the power to completely channel and control nature and so on, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that's different. Now, if your question is more like, are there comparable concepts in history? I would say, yeah, probably. I mean, anytime you have the notion of divine revelation or something like that, you have something kind of similar. But the big difference is that nobody construes prior to this moment anyway. I won't say prior to Kant because I don't, there are lots of people that said things in the last, 10,000 years or whatever. But prior to Kant, this notion of divine revelation was never natural. It was always supernatural.
Mm.
And so there is something kind of interesting, which is that Kant is taking something theological, this idea of the still small voice, that you don't know the source of, or maybe, Socrates' daemon or whatever. Um, there are similar ideas where it's like, well, where does the daemon get? Who's the daemon's daemon or whatever? You could have some kind of infinite regress, but the point is that that sort of sense of there being a source other than your rational mind that nonetheless supplies your mind with ideas,
Mm.
that goes back quite far, but it's never nature that's doing that. Right. And so here it is nature. And so there is a sort of you could say collapse of the spiritual world, or perhaps a deification of nature to a certain extent here in what Kant seems to be saying. Of course, it's very important to remember that art is not religion for Kant. So it's not really um, spiritual in the sense there is still the capacity for spiritual life, etc. That's more in the domain of morality for Kant. But there is this very similar kind of structure, this idea of revelation. But here it's revelation of nature. Now, I suppose one thing you might say is these moments that, so when you get to the section on aesthetic ideas, hopefully we'll get there, we should hurry. Kant does think that aesthetic ideas are available not just in art, but also in experiences of nature. And so maybe there's a sort of sense that you can read spiritual expressions, if not truths, off of nature. And that's an idea that goes back quite far in, the Abrahamic traditions, at least,
Mm.
that nature is a symbol for God's plan or some kind of spiritual truth, even though it's not itself spiritual, it nonetheless embodies certain symbols of spirituality. So, I don't know if you remember Arshia when we were doing the Ives course and we talked about Puritanism and typology. Yeah,
Mm.
there is a kind of similar idea to that in what Kant is saying. It's just that God doesn't play a particular role here. It's nature that's, the voice from nowhere or something.
Mm.
Um, yeah.
Got it. Thank you. I
Yeah.
have to leave now because I have to get
Oh,
to
you do.
class by
Oh,
at 9. I mean, I have to be in class at 9:30 and I have 30 minutes to get there. Because
I see. And I didn't understand because aesthetic ideas are for me. So aesthetic ideas are going to do two things. One, they're just, I think, kind of the most interesting part of this because it's really going to show how you express that which can't be expressed. But it's also going to connect the idea of genius to that idea of complete communication.
mm,
So I don't know what to tell you. I really think it's important to understand that. What is your class?
It's the history of jazz that Mark Seals teaches.
That's like that has like 300 students.
No, it's literally two. It's me and somebody else. So if I
Oh,
don't show
really?
up, yeah, it's gonna
What?
be like
That used to be like one of those huge lecture classes. Oh, all right. Well, uh, can we like just on Friday spend or some other day spend 30 minutes on aesthetic ideas? Because I think it's pretty important.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. I can make any time necessary for it.
Yeah, okay. Um, do you want to sit in on the aesthetic ideas thing, Justin?
Sure. Yeah, I haven't gotten a chance to read what you sent yet, but
Mm.
I'll take a look at it and yeah, so what time on Friday?
Let's see. I teach from 10:30. Let's see. I think well, I guess you guys want to go to comp lab, so we can't do it then. Uh, could be 9:30, I guess. Yeah, actually, I'll probably do my lessons on Zoom on Friday, so we could do a 9:30 session or something on
I
Friday.
have the jazz class at
Oh, you
9:30
have it
again
then
because
I
on
also
it's
will.
Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Monday, Wednesday, Friday.
Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Okay. I mean, it could be at like I'll be totally fried on Friday afternoon, so I don't know how good of an idea that is. It doesn't have to be Friday. Let me think.
Thursday, by any chance?
Thursday's always pretty full for me, but I could do it at around 1:30.
I can make that.
How does that work for you, Justin?
I had so oh, yeah, I might be a little bit late. I have a like a Zoom telemedicine appointment, but yeah, I can
Okay.
probably come.
When is your appointment?
It's at 1,
Is it
so I
one?
might wrap
Okay.
up at
Yeah,
1:30.
it could be a little bit late. I might even be a little bit late. I do this I'm in like an improv collective with people all over the world, and we improvise over Sonobus and Zoom. So that's what I do on Thursday mornings, and it's usually done around 1:30. But sometimes it's late. I could leave early too. I could be there right at 1:30. I think it should be fine. So let's just say 1:30. And
Okay.
we have to be a little bit late. That's probably okay.
I have nothing else after that for like a few hours until like in the evening. So
Okay.
I'm okay.
So what I'm gonna want you guys to do is really read 49, section 49 really closely
Okay.
and tell me what is going on. And maybe read a bit of 51 to wrap your head around complete communication. That idea a little bit more. Um, but yeah, that's what we're going to do. So read 49, and then you'll want to think about how does that connect genius to complete communication.
Mm, mm. Okay.
I'm good. All right. I will see
All
you
right.
Thursday.
Awesome.
Good.
Thank you.
Yeah. See you. Bye bye.